My name is Maya Vance, and I'm 31 years old. For years ago, my sister told my parents I was a financial ruin. She said I was fired, drowning in debt, and begging neighbors for handouts. She lied. And because my family values status over blood, that single lie cost me everything. They blocked my number. They changed the locks on the family home. They scrubbed me from the family photos as if I were a stain on their reputation. For 4 years, I was the daughter they were ashamed to name. Then, last Tuesday, a historic estate in their neighborhood went up for foreclosure. My sister was on the front lawn with a check she could barely afford, waiting to finally claim the crown. But when the auctioneer announced the winning bidder, a cash offer for $3 million, and I stepped out of the black car with the deed in my hand, my mother's glass of champagne hit the pavement. She stared at the woman she thought was living in a sedan, and for the first time in 4 years, she forgot how to breathe. Before we dive into how I bought the house next door just to watch them realize the truth, please take a moment to like and subscribe. But only if you've ever been the black sheep who proved everyone wrong. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I'm reading every single one of them. Now, let me take you back to a rainy Tuesday in 2022. To a mahogany dining table in Oak Ridge, and the very last time my sister ever smiled at me without a knife behind her back. The Vance house didn't just sit on a hill, it loomed over it. In Oak Ridge, prestige was measured in the depth of your crown molding and the silence of your irrigation system. My parents, Richard and Elena, treated our family name like a stock price that needed constant defending. To them, I was a stable but boring investment, a software engineer who wore sensible loafers and drove a 3-year-old sedan. Sloane, however, was the high-growth asset. She dressed in quiet luxury that was remarkably loud, decorating her life with designer labels and a marketing job that seemed to consist mostly of taking lunch meetings at country clubs. At the center of it all was the mahogany dining table, a piece of furniture that felt more like a boardroom than a place for a family to eat. That Tuesday, the air was thick with the scent of rosemary chicken and my father's quiet expectation. I had just told them I was leaving my secure position at a tier 1 firm to join a 3-person startup in a garage. The silence that followed was freezing. "A startup, Maya," my father said, his fork hovering. "That sounds unstable." Sloane didn't miss a beat. She set her wine glass down with a delicate clink that sounded like a gavel. "It's worse than unstable, Dad." I didn't want to say anything, but I saw Maya's credit card get declined at that boutique last week. And I heard from a friend in HR that she didn't leave her old job, she was let go for performance issues. I stared at her, my blood turning to ice. "Sloane, what are you talking about?" "I have the offer letter in my bag. I quit to take a bigger risk." "It's okay to be embarrassed, Maya," Sloane whispered, her eyes shining with a terrifying, manufactured pity. "But lying about being broke just makes it pathetic. I know you've been taking out payday loans just to keep up appearances. You're going to drag the Vance name into the mud." My mother's face went pale. To her, debt was a communicable disease. She didn't ask for my side. She didn't look at the evidence. She simply looked at my father, who set his napkin down with finality. "We cannot be associated with financial ruin, Maya," he said. "Until you have your affairs in order and can prove you aren't a liability, we need space." By the time I reached my car, the digital execution was complete. My sister's lie had traveled at the speed of light. I tried to call my mother, blocked. I tried my father, straight to voicemail. A group text from our extended family popped up. "Maya has been removed from the chat." I sat in the dark of my sedan, gripped the steering wheel, and realized I was officially a ghost in my own life. Sloane had won the house, the table, and the parents. She just didn't know I was about to build a haunting they would never forget. For the next 2 years, the city became my sanctuary and my forge. I lived in a studio apartment that smelled of roasted coffee and old radiator steam, working 18-hour days in a windowless office that felt like a submarine. While Sloane was busy posting photos of gala tickets and designer handbags in Oak Ridge, I was buried in millions of lines of code. Medical school has its cadavers, but software engineering has its dead ends, the nights where the logic fails, the funding dries up, and you're staring at a bank balance that wouldn't cover a week's groceries. There were moments when I almost picked up the phone to beg for a seat at that mahogany table again. But then I'd remember the look of disgust on my mother's face, and I'd go back to the screen. Everything changed on a Tuesday in October. My mentor, Elias Thorne, a man who dressed like a high school teacher but owned half the servers in Northern Virginia, walked into the office and closed the door. "The IPO went live an hour ago," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. The stock opened at 42. It just hit 68. I didn't scream. I didn't celebrate. I pulled up my vesting schedule on my monitor. The numbers were so large they looked like a glitch. I wasn't just stable. I was liquid in a way my father couldn't even dream of. "True wealth is invisible, Maya," Elias told me as he handed me a celebratory scotch. "The loudest person in the room is usually the one with the biggest debt. Remember that when you decide what to do next." I spent the next year building my architecture of justice. I didn't buy a Ferrari. I didn't post a single photo. I stayed a ghost, letting Sloane's narrative about my downward spiral harden into a fact in the minds of my family. I waited until Aunt Ruth mentioned over a secret lunch that the historic Sterling estate, the crown jewel of Oak Ridge, located exactly 12 feet from my parents' property line, was heading to a foreclosure auction. Sloane had been eyeing that house for a decade, calling it her destiny. She thought she was going to buy it for a song because no one else in town had the liquid capital. She was wrong. I wasn't just going home. I was going to become the neighbor they couldn't ignore. The morning of the auction, Oak Ridge looked exactly the same, but I felt like a stranger from a different galaxy. I pulled into a side street 3 blocks away, wearing a nondescript trench coat and oversized sunglasses. I didn't want to be Maya Vance today. I was the Sterling Group LLC, a paper entity with a bank account that could swallow my sister's aspirations whole. The Sterling estate was a sprawling colonial, its white pillars peeling slightly, standing like a fallen king. On the front lawn, a small crowd had gathered under a striped tent. My parents were there, standing close to Sloane, who was dressed in a sharp power suit, clutching a leather folder. I stood at the very back, near a hydrangea bush, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "This house belongs to us, Richard," I heard my mother whisper. "It's the only way to fix the neighborhood's perception after everything." Everything was me. I was the stain they were trying to outshine. The auctioneer stepped onto the porch, his voice amplified by a portable speaker that cut through the crisp morning air. The starting bid was $1.5 million. Sloane raised her paddle immediately, a smug, practiced smile on her face. She thought she was the only predator in the water. The price climbed steadily. 1.8. 2 million. At 2.2, the local developers dropped out. Sloane's smile faltered for a second, then she raised her paddle again. 2.4, she called out, her voice slightly shrill. That's when I stepped out from the shadows of the hydrangea. I didn't raise a paddle. I just raised my hand. 2.6. Cash. The crowd turned. My mother squinted through the sunlight, but with my hat and glasses, I was just another investor. Sloane's face contorted. 2.7, she barked, glancing nervously at my father. I knew her limit. Aunt Ruth had told me Sloane had been liquidating her meager 401k just to make the deposit. 3 million, I said, my voice as cold and level as a surgeon's blade. All cash. No contingencies. Proof of funds is already with the trustee. The auctioneer looked at Sloane. She was trembling, her face a mask of panicked calculation. She looked at our father, begging for a loan with her eyes, but he stayed still, his jaw tight. He knew they didn't have it. Going once, the auctioneer shouted. Going twice. The gavel hit the podium with a crack that echoed through the valley. Sold. To the representative from the Sterling Group. Sloane slumped, her destiny evaporating into the morning mist. I turned and walked back toward my car before they could get a closer look. I had the keys. I had the land. Now, all I had to do was wait for the moving trucks to arrive. Moving day was a calculated tactical strike. I didn't hire a local company. I hired a premium white glove service that arrived in 3 massive, unmarked black semi-trucks. They didn't just pull up to the Sterling estate. They staged themselves with precision, effectively bottlenecking the shared private cul-de-sac and pinning Sloane's flashy European SUV into her own driveway. The noise, the hiss of air brakes, and the rhythmic thud of heavy ramps brought the neighborhood to their front porches. My parents were the first to emerge, Richard in his pressed khakis and Elena clutching a silk scarf, looking offended that their morning silence had been invaded by the help. Sloane followed, her face a thundercloud of entitlement as she marched toward the lead driver. "You're blocking my exit," she shrieked, gesturing wildly at the trucks. "Do you have any idea who lives here? You need to move these crates to the service entrance immediately." I watched from the tinted backseat of my car as the driver politely handed her a clipboard. "Sorry, ma'am." The owner's instructions were to offload the grand piano and the art collection through the front rotunda. "We'll be here all day." The owner. Sloane spat the word like it was poison. "The owner is an investment group. I'll be calling their board by noon." This was the moment. I opened the car door and stepped onto the pavement. The clicking of my heels on the asphalt was the only sound in the sudden silence. I took off my sunglasses and let the bright morning sun hit my face. Elena's hand went to her throat. Richard's mouth opened, but no sound came out. It was Sloane who broke first, her voice cracking with a mixture of confusion and renewed vitriol. "Maya, what are you doing here? Did you get a job as a personal assistant for the owners? You can't have the help blocking my driveway just because you're bitter." I didn't answer her. I walked past her, straight to the lead mover, and took the keys he was holding. I turned back to my family, holding the heavy brass ring up so the sunlight glinted off the metal. "I'm not the help, Sloane," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the manicured lawns. "I'm the board. And since you've spent 4 years telling everyone I was homeless, I figured I should finally move into a place big enough to store all the payday loans you claimed I had." The blood drained from my mother's face as she looked from me to the towering pillars of the estate I now owned. The broke sister hadn't just returned. She had become the landlord of their most cherished dreams. The neighborhood block party was an Oak Ridge tradition, a curated display of wealth, wine, and whispered gossip. My parents had spent weeks trying to explain my presence next door, spinning a new lie that they had secretly funded my lucky break. But I wasn't playing their game anymore. I had invited a very specific guest, the head of the Homeowners Association, who happened to be the wife of the bank manager Sloane had been consulting for her failed loan. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, golden shadows over the Sterling estate, I stood on my new porch, looking down at the crowd. Sloane was in the center of a circle of neighbors, her voice loud and desperate. "It's just a tech bubble," she was saying, clutching a glass of rose. "Maya is still financially reckless. My parents are the ones who actually secured the deed." I walked down the steps, my bank manager guest by my side. "Actually, Sloane," I said, my voice cutting through her performance like a cold front. "I think it's time we talk about your financial dignity." I didn't have to say much. My guest did the rest, casually mentioning that the bank had flagged Sloane's application for document irregularities, a polite term for the forged income statement Sloane had used to trick our parents into giving her their retirement savings for a joint investment. The silence that followed was deafening. My father looked at Sloane, then at the bank manager, the realization of his daughter's true status finally breaking through his pride. He had bankrolled a fraud while exiling a millionaire. "Sloane." Richard's voice was a low growl of pure betrayal. Sloane's glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the stone path. She looked around the circle of neighbors she had spent her life trying to impress and saw only pity and disgust. She didn't have a script for this. She turned and fled into her house, the heavy oak door slamming behind her. My parents turned to me, their faces aged and broken. "Maya," my mother whispered, reaching out a hand. "We didn't know. We were just trying to protect the family." "You weren't protecting the family, Mom," I said, stepping back just enough to keep the boundary clear. "You were protecting an image. And images are fragile." I looked at the two houses, one built on the shifting sand of Sloane's lies, and mine, bought with the quiet, hard truth of my own labor. "I'm not closing the door," I told them, glancing at the 4 chairs I had set out on my new patio. But if you want to sit at my table, you leave the Vance name and its dignity at the gate. From now on, we deal in reality. Or we don't deal at all. I turned and walked back into the Sterling estate. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the invisible daughter or the broke outcast. I was the architect of my own world, and the view from the top was finally clear.